The fire had barely died when I found the cabin colder than the snowstorm outside. I pulled the knit blanket tighter, my bones aching, not from age, but from the silence Megan left behind. My daughter-in-law turned off the heat and called it a lesson. A lesson. After opening my home to her, after treating her like family, after raising the son she now controlled like a puppet, I was just a burden to be taught. That night, the cold wasn't what froze me. It was the realization that respect doesn't come with blood. Sometimes it must be written in ink. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The snow outside was falling in lazy spirals, drifting down onto the dark pines that pressed against the edges of Helen Marshall's mountain cabin. The wind moaned softly through the eaves, but inside, everything was warm, at least for the moment. Helen sat in her favorite armchair, a heavy knit throw pulled across her lap, steam rising from the chamomile tea in her hands. The fire in the stone hearth crackled with low orange light, throwing shifting shadows across the cabin's rustic beams. Nights like this, she thought, were why she'd chosen to retire in Aspen. Peace, solitude, the hush of snow muffling the world. Behind her, she heard the faint click of the back door and then the sound of boots on hardwood. Megan's voice followed, high and light, too casual. Your heater isn't working. Helen didn't turn right away. She took another sip of tea, forcing herself to remain unbothered. The fire's doing just fine, she answered, her eyes fixed on the flames. Megan stepped closer, her perfume carrying a sharp floral bite that clashed with the smell of burning wood. I'm just saying, you might want to get it checked. Can't have the place freezing up on you. Her tone suggested amusement rather than concern. Helen finally looked up. Megan was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. She didn't offer to help, didn't suggest calling a technician, just stood there, perfectly composed, as if the cabin's warmth or cold meant nothing to her. Minutes passed. The fire's heat began to dwindle, the room subtly shifting from cozy to chilly. Helen set her teacup down, her brows knitting. The heater rarely failed. Rising from her chair, she padded across the room, slippers brushing against the floorboards, and checked the thermostat mounted near the kitchen archway. Her breath caught. The screen wasn't showing an error or a malfunction. The system wasn't broken. It had been turned off. She pressed a button, trying to wake the system back up. Nothing. A chill curled through her chest, sharper than the cold air spreading across the cabin. Someone had switched the entire unit off from the breaker. That someone could only be Megan. Helen turned slowly, her eyes meeting Megan's. The younger woman didn't look surprised at all. Instead, she tilted her head with deliberate sweetness, voice dripping with mock concern. Maybe it's time you learn how to manage your home without all the gadgets. Builds character. The words landed like a slap. Helen's throat tightened, not from the cold, but from the brazenness in Megan's voice. She wanted to respond. Sharp words sat at the edge of her tongue, but years of teaching had taught her restraint. She refused to give Megan the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. So she said nothing. The silence between them was heavier than the snow piling outside. Megan smirked again, then turned and walked toward the door. Good luck, Helen, she tossed over her shoulder, almost cheerfully, as if she'd just done something witty. The door clicked shut, and then she was gone, her boots crunching over the snow as she crossed the porch. Alone again, Helen stood in the middle of her cabin, arms folded tightly against herself. The cold seeped in fast, coiling around her fingers, her shoulders, her bones. The fire's glow could only reach so far, and already she could see her breath. She drew the blanket tighter around her body, lowered herself back into her chair, and stared at the flames that suddenly felt smaller, weaker. Her thoughts refused to quiet. Megan's words echoed. Maybe it's time you learn. Learn what? That cruelty could masquerade as teaching? That her son's wife thought humiliation was a form of discipline? Helen pressed her lips together until they went white. She would not beg for warmth. She would not call Megan back, nor call Tom and complain like some helpless old woman. No. She sat shivering, the taste of cooling tea bitter on her tongue. Her eyes locked on the fire until the room blurred around its glow. The cabin, usually her sanctuary, felt altered. Like an intruder had left fingerprints everywhere. Each creak of the rafters, each groan of the wind outside, seemed to underscore the truth. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A message. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Megan thought she was teaching her a lesson. But as the clock ticked loudly in the stillness, Helen realized something else entirely. This night would be remembered not for what she lost, but for the resolve that began to spark in the pit of her chest, brighter than the dwindling fire. And then with a shudder, the last ember collapsed in the hearth, throwing the cabin into shadows and cold. Helen's eyes did not leave the dark. She whispered into the emptiness, "So be it." The cold had claimed the room, but Helen's silence carried its own threat. Morning light crept across the snow-dusted peaks outside Helen's window, painting the cabin in pale blue shadows. She hadn't slept well. The night's chill lingered in her bones, leaving her joints stiff and her thoughts heavy. Even after she'd managed to coax the heater back on, the memory of Megan's smug voice had stayed with her, gnawing at the quiet hours. Helen sat at her kitchen table now, nursing a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, her phone lying face up beside it. The fire crackled again in the hearth, but its warmth felt hollow. What unsettled her most wasn't the cold. It was the intent behind it. A line had been crossed, one that couldn't be walked back with polite apologies. Her thumb hovered above the phone screen, hesitation prickling her chest. Then, with a decisive breath, she dialed David Brooks. The line rang once, twice, before a familiar baritone answered. "Helen, I was just about to call you. How are you holding up?" She closed her eyes briefly, letting the steadiness in his voice ground her. "I've been better," she admitted. "Something happened last night." David's tone sharpened. "No nonsense now. Tell me." Helen recounted the evening in measured words, choosing each detail carefully. The thermostat switched off. Megan's smirk. The comment about teaching her a lesson. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The cruelty spoke for itself. When she finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Then David exhaled slowly. That wasn't carelessness. That was intent. Helen stared at the steam curling from her coffee. Her reflection fractured in the surface. "It was a small act," she said quietly, "but it told me everything I needed to know. And I won't ignore it this time. Not anymore." "I understand," David's voice softened, but beneath it lay iron. "You've given her chance after chance, Helen. If you want my advice, make it final. Update your will. Put it in black and white so there's no ambiguity." Helen's chest tightened at the word final. A will wasn't just paperwork. It was a statement of values, a reflection of who she trusted to carry forward what she'd built. She thought of Tom, her only child, forever trying to smooth over conflicts instead of facing them. She thought of Megan's calculating eyes, her sense of entitlement like a shadow that never lifted. Her fingers traced the rim of the coffee mug. "I've been avoiding this decision for too long," she murmured. "Maybe I hoped she'd change. Maybe I didn't want to admit what she really was." She swallowed hard. "But she showed me last night." On the other end, David waited. Letting her words settle, Helen straightened, a spark of resolve igniting. "Draw up the changes. Megan won't see a dime of what I leave behind. If she thinks she can teach me lessons, then this will be hers to learn." There was no hesitation in David's reply. "I'll prepare the documents today. Once you sign, they'll be airtight, beyond contestation." The certainty in his tone steadied her like a hand at her back. Still, a pang of sorrow cut through. "Tom won't take this easily," she admitted. "He'll see it as an attack on his marriage. He'll want me to undo it." "You've spent a lifetime teaching others to stand on their own," David reminded her gently. "Maybe it's time Tom learned how to stand on his, without Megan propping him up." Helen managed a wry, tired smile. "That conversation is going to hurt," she sighed, long and low. "But it's for the best." Outside, the wind rattled the pines against the windows, a low, restless sound. She glanced toward the snow-blanketed path leading to her porch, the same path Megan had walked across last night, with her head high and her heart cold. Helen wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her gaze sharpening. The cold of last night had been temporary. What came next would cut deeper, and Megan wouldn't see it coming. The following afternoon, Helen stepped into David Brooks' office, her boots brushing against the thick gray carpet that muffled the outside world. The building, set in the heart of Aspen's small but bustling downtown, exuded a hush of seriousness. Leather-bound law books lined the shelves, snowmelt streaked the tall windows, and the faint smell of cedar polish clung to the heavy desk between them. David rose when she entered, his salt and pepper hair catching the light. "You made it," he said, ushering her to a chair with the ease of someone who'd known her for decades. Helen nodded, unwinding her scarf. The cabin's solitude had given her space to decide. Now, here in this office, the decision would take shape in ink. On the desk lay a neat stack of papers, bound with a silver clip. David tapped the top sheet. "Your revised will. Everything we discussed last night is reflected here." Helen reached for the pages, the paper cool and stiff beneath her fingers. She scanned line after line, her eyes catching on familiar words. Assets, estate, distribution. It was the same structure she'd reviewed years earlier, only now one name was missing. Megan's absence on the page was stark, almost ghostly. Where once her daughter-in-law had been written into the lines of Helen's legacy, there was only blank space, clean, erased. David studied her face. "Are you certain, Helen? This is permanent. You know Tom will notice." Helen let the papers rest on the desk. For a moment, her chest ached, not for Megan, but for the sun caught in between. "Tom's been avoiding the truth for years," she said finally, her voice firm. "He has to face it now. I can't shield him from the consequences of his choices. Not anymore." David leaned back in his chair, steepling his hands. "And what do you expect him to think? To feel?" Helen's gaze lifted to the window. Outside, skiers cut across the slopes like streaks of color against the white mountain. "He'll feel torn, maybe betrayed. But if he truly loves me, he'll understand in time. And if he doesn't—" She trailed off, then straightened. "Then at least my decision will stand. According to his actions, he'll get what he deserves. No more, no less." Her words hung in the air like frost. David gave a small nod, his expression unreadable but not unsympathetic. "You've always been clear when it mattered most. This is no different." He tapped the pages again. "Legally, this will be ironclad. Megan has no standing to contest it. We've closed every door she might try to pry open." Helen picked up the pen David slid across the desk. Its weight felt heavier than it should, as though centuries of decisions and regrets were pressed into the barrel. Her hand trembled just slightly as she poised it over the signature line. The ink spread smoothly across the paper as she wrote her name, the loops of her letters bold, final. When she lifted the pen, her pulse slowed, steadied. It was done. For a long moment, she stared at the ink drying on the page, realizing the enormity of what she had just done. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. She had reclaimed the right to decide who belonged to her future and who did not. David gathered the signed pages, sliding them back into the neat folder. "Consider this chapter closed," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "From here on out, Helen, you hold all the cards." Helen leaned back, exhaling deeply, as if years of quiet resentment had been carried out of her lungs. Yet, beneath the calm, a restless flicker stirred. This wasn't just about Megan. This was about Tom, and the storm that would break once he learned the truth. Her fingers brushed the arm of her chair, tightening until her knuckles paled. The ink was barely dry, but already she could feel the ripple of consequence heading toward her family. By evening, Helen was back in her cabin. The folder from David's office sat on the dining table, its crisp corners catching the firelight like a quiet sentinel. Every time she passed it, she felt the weight of her decision pulsing in the room, a sealed future no one else yet knew about. Her phone buzzed against the wood. A new message. "Megan. Hey, about the heater last night. Total accident. I didn't realize the breaker flipped. Sorry if it caused any trouble." Helen read the words twice, her lips pressing into a thin line. The text reeked of performance. She could almost hear Megan's voice, feigning innocence while masking amusement. Total accident. As if Helen hadn't seen the smirk, hadn't felt the deliberate sting in every word Megan had chosen. She set the phone down, unwilling to be baited. The fire crackled. The wind rattled the cabin's windows, and for a moment Helen considered leaving the message unanswered. But silence, she knew, could sometimes be mistaken for weakness. Her fingers tapped the screen, each keystroke slow, deliberate. Helen. No apology needed. You've made your position clear. She hit send, then placed the phone face down and returned to her chair. A sharp calm spread through her chest. There would be no drawn-out back and forth, no wrangling for false peace. The line between them was already drawn. Minutes later, the phone buzzed again. She didn't move. Another vibration, longer this time. Megan calling. Helen stared at the glowing screen, Megan's name pulsing like an unwanted visitor at her door. She let it ring out, the silence afterward more satisfying than words could ever be. But peace didn't last long. 10 minutes later, her phone lit up once more. Tom. Helen hesitated, then answered. His voice came through immediately, low and tight. Mom? Why aren't you picking up Megan's calls? Helen leaned back, her gaze steady on the fire. Because I don't need to, she said evenly. Tom exhaled hard on the other end. She said there was some misunderstanding about the heater. You're acting distant. What's going on? Helen's grip tightened on the phone. She could picture him pacing, shoulders hunched, brow furrowed, torn between wife and mother the way he always was. It wasn't a misunderstanding, she said, her tone calm but edged with steel. Your wife turned the heater off to teach me a lesson. There was silence, then a faint stammer. That doesn't sound like her. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Tom's denial was a familiar shield, one she had seen him raise countless times. It does sound like her. It was deliberate, Tom, and I'm not going to argue with you about it. He started to protest, but Helen cut him off. You need to listen to me now. She taught me her lesson, and I've decided to teach her one in return. Her words landed heavy in the air, echoing even after she pulled the phone from her ear. Tom didn't respond right away, his silence stretching into something thick and uneasy. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed, uncertain. What do you mean? Helen didn't answer. Instead, she let the silence press against him the way Megan's had pressed against her last night. Then, before he could say more, she ended the call. The fire popped sharply, sending sparks against the screen. Helen set the phone back on the table beside the folder. The contrast struck her. The quiet permanence of ink, the ephemeral flicker of text messages and calls. One was final, the other noise. She drew her shawl tighter, her gaze steady, unflinching. Megan thought she'd delivered a lesson in power. Tom thought denial could erase truth. They were both about to learn otherwise. Tom leaned against the marble counter of the lodge kitchen, scrolling absently on his phone, while Megan paced the room like she was orchestrating a board meeting. Snow pressed heavy against the tall windows, muting the mountain view, but Megan's voice filled the space, sharp and unrelenting. She doesn't get it, Tom. Your mother acts like she holds all the power, but she won't keep it up. She's nearly 70. She's not going to drag this feud to the grave. Sooner or later, she'll soften. Megan planted her manicured hands on the counter, her eyes flashing. And when she does, we'll be ready. Tom rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaustion written in the slump of his shoulders. Meg, you're making it sound like we're circling for a prize. It's my mom we're talking about. Megan's laugh was clipped, humorless. It is a prize. Her estate is massive. The cabin, the lodge shares, the investments. Don't pretend you don't know what's at stake. That kind of money sets us up forever. Tom's stomach turned. He thought of his mother alone in her cabin, her voice steady but cold on the phone the night before. He hadn't wanted to believe her, but deep down he knew she'd been telling the truth. Still, he lacked the words or courage to admit it aloud. Megan, oblivious to his hesitation, was already outlining their future. We could finally expand, buy that house in Denver I've been eyeing, upgrade the Range Rover, maybe even take the kids skiing in Switzerland next winter. You don't have to settle for scraps when the whole table will be ours. Meg, Tom's voice was low, weighted with unease. You're assuming too much. Mom isn't predictable. You know how stubborn she is. Megan whirled on him, her earrings catching the light. She's stubborn, not stupid. She knows keeping me happy keeps you happy. And believe me, Tom, She won't risk losing you over something as petty as a heater." Tom said nothing. He stared down at the coffee mug in his hands, his reflection distorted in the swirl of black liquid. Every word out of Megan's mouth widened the distance between him and the woman who had raised him. Across town, in David's office, Helen received a quiet phone call. "It's filed," David said. His voice carried no triumph, only certainty. "The court has recorded the new will. Megan is officially out." Helen exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting toward the window, where snowflakes drifted in soft spirals. "Then it's done," she murmured. When she ended the call, she didn't feel relief so much as gravity. There would be no undoing this choice. Megan had closed the door with her own arrogance. Helen had only locked it. That same evening, Megan stormed into the lodge's sitting room with her phone clutched in her hand, her nails clicking against the glass. What?" she snapped, scrolling furiously through a forwarded email from her contact at the county office. Her name, the one she had expected to see inked into the estate, was missing. Wiped clean. She spun on Tom, her face flushed. "She cut me out. Your mother cut me out completely. Do you know what this means?" Tom stiffened. He'd been expecting this storm but still flinched beneath its force. "Meg, calm down." "Calm down?" Megan's voice cracked like a whip. "She betrayed us. Betrayed me. After everything I've put into this family, she dares erase me like I'm disposable." She jabbed her finger toward him. "Don't you see? She's not punishing me. She's punishing you." Tom opened his mouth, then closed it again, torn clean in half. He wanted to defend his mother, to remind Megan that kindness and respect couldn't be bought. But guilt, years of choosing silence, chained his tongue. Megan's eyes narrowed, cold and sharp as glass. "This isn't over. If she thinks she can humiliate me, she has no idea who she's dealing with." Tom stared at her, his heart sinking. He realized with a hollow certainty that the fight ahead wouldn't just be between his wife and his mother. It would drag him into the center, tearing him in two. The knock on Helen's door wasn't a knock at all. It was a pounding, each strike rattling the frame. Snow swirled outside the cabin, the storm mirroring the one Helen knew was waiting on the porch. She rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She refused to be dragged into Megan's rhythm. When she opened the door, Megan was there, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her fury, breath huffing in sharp clouds. "How dare you?" she spat, shoving past Helen without waiting for an invitation. Snow clung to her boots, melting instantly against the warm wood floors. Helen shut the door gently, turning with a calm that only sharpened Megan's anger. "How dare I?" she echoed, her voice level. "How dare you disrespect me in my own home?" Megan spun, eyes blazing. "Disrespect? You cut me out of your will like I'm some stranger off the street? Do you have any idea what that does to this family, to Tom?" Helen's eyes narrowed, unshaken. "What I did was protect my legacy. And protect myself. You call it betrayal. I call it clarity." Megan's hands flew up, her voice rising. "Clarity? This is revenge over a heater. A heater, Helen. You're overreacting. Blowing one silly thing out of proportion." Helen's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, cool as the snow pressing against the windows. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You don't get to teach me lessons, Megan. I've lived my life with dignity. I've raised a son, built a career, earned every ounce of what I have. What I expect, what I deserve, is respect. And last night, you made it very clear that's something you're not capable of giving." The words cut deeper than any shout could. Megan flinched, then recovered, her fury flaring brighter. "You think this ends here? You think you can erase me with a pen stroke? I'm Tom's wife. That makes me family, whether you like it or not." Helen remained silent, her stillness more powerful than any rebuttal. Megan's tirade filled the room, echoing off the timber beams, her anger clawing for control. Helen simply stood, watching, letting Megan's voice lose its sharpness against the weight of her composure. Finally, when Megan paused, out of breath, Helen's voice slid into the quiet like steel through velvet. "This isn't about a broken heater. It's about the way you've treated me since the day you walked into this family. You mistake cruelty for cleverness, arrogance for strength, and you thought I'd tolerate it forever." Megan's jaw tightened, her chest heaving. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Just a shadow, but enough for Helen to see it. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of wind against the glass. Helen's posture was unyielding, her chin lifted, her voice final. "You've taught me enough about who you are. I don't need any more lessons." Megan stared at her, hands trembling at her sides. She looked as if she might lash out again, her mouth opening with some fresh accusation. But no words came. Helen's calm had stolen them from her. The fire crackled in the corner, the only sound in the thick air. And then, with a sharp scrape of her boots against the wood, Megan moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle, her voice low but laced with venom. "You'll regret this, Helen. I'll make sure of it." Helen didn't flinch. She simply turned back toward the fire, her back to Megan. "Respect," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's all I ever asked for." The door slammed. Shaking the cabin, snow rushed in for a brief second before it sealed again, leaving Helen alone with the firelight and her own steady heartbeat. Megan's fury didn't stop at Helen's cabin door. By morning, the hum of her anger had found its way into the office of a local attorney, her voice raised enough that the receptionist outside could hear every word. "I don't care what she signed," Megan snapped, pacing across the lawyer's conference room, heels striking sharp against the polished wood floor. "I'm Tom's wife. I've been part of this family for a decade. You're telling me I can just be erased like I never existed?" The lawyer, a thin man in a navy suit, lifted his palms in caution. "Inheritance law isn't about fairness, it's about legal standing. And from what you're describing, your mother-in-law acted within her rights. Unless we can prove undue influence or incapacity." Megan cut him off, her words spilling like venom. "So you're saying she can just cut me out because she's in a mood? That's ridiculous. This is family. Family has rights." The lawyer sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Megan, family loyalty isn't enforceable in court. Paperwork is. And if the will is as airtight as you're suggesting, then contesting it will be—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Difficult." Back in her cabin, Helen received the news in a quieter tone. David sat across from her, his voice measured but reassuring. "She's already reached out to counsel, but Helen, I've reviewed the filings myself. Everything is clean. There's no loophole here. If she takes this to court, she'll lose." Helen poured tea into 2 mugs, her movements steady, almost serene. "Let her try," she said softly, sliding a mug toward David. "I've spent enough of my life dancing around her demands. That ends now." Her lawyer studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "It's good to see you so certain." Outside, the snow glittered in the afternoon sun, a sharp contrast to the storm the night before. Helen found herself breathing easier, her shoulders unburdened. Megan could rage, hire lawyers, make threats, but Helen's foundation was solid. Instead of dwelling on the drama, she turned her focus toward her next project. The community center in Aspen had asked her to lead a fundraising effort for children's programs. The thought of giving her time and energy to something meaningful, something untangled from family politics, filled her with a quiet strength. That evening, while drafting a letter to the center, Helen's phone buzzed. Another message from Megan. "Megan, you think you can erase me with signatures? You can't. Tom won't stand for this. The family won't stand for this. You'll see." Helen read the words without flinching. Slowly, she set her pen down, picked up the phone, and typed a response. "Helen, you're out of my life. Learn to live with that." Her thumb pressed send. The quiet ping that followed was final, almost ceremonial. For a moment, she stared at the screen, half expecting Megan to fire back instantly, but no reply came. Only the soft whisper of the fire behind her, and the distant call of wind through the pines. Helen leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She had taken her action, and it was irreversible. Megan could scream, threaten, flail, but the truth was written in ink, sealed by law, and reinforced by Helen's own resolve. Yet even in the silence, Helen knew the storm wasn't over. People like Megan didn't retreat quietly. They regrouped, recalculated. And when they struck again, they did so harder. 2 days later, Aspen's small-town quiet was pierced by the shrill edge of gossip. It started with a post on a local blog. Aspen matriarch cuts daughter-in-law out of fortune. Within hours, the story leapt from whispers in cafes to headlines in Denver's online outlets. Meghan's fingerprints were all over it. On the morning news, a clip of her interview played. Her voice syrupy and self-righteous. Helen Marshall has always been vindictive. I've stood by this family for years, and this is how she repays me, by erasing me, humiliating me. No reasonable person would treat their daughter-in-law this way. Helen sat in her cabin, the television muted. She didn't need the volume to read the venom in Meghan's eyes. The words vindictive and unreasonable scrolled across the screen in bold, tabloid red letters. She reached for her teacup, unhurried, and sipped. The fire in the hearth glowed softly, the snow outside falling in delicate veils. The contrast between Meghan's chaos and her own calm was almost poetic. David arrived later that afternoon, a folded newspaper under his arm. "It's everywhere," he said, laying it on the table. The headline screamed accusations, but David's tone was steady. "My advice? Don't give them a single word. Let Meghan twist herself into knots." Helen glanced at the paper, then back at him. "And if they ask me to respond?" "You don't," David replied. "Silence speaks louder than any defense. Right now, Meghan's the one screaming in the wind. Let her noise expose her." Helen leaned back, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. With a small, knowing smile, she lifted her cup again. "Let them talk. It only makes them look worse." The following week, the frenzy began to unravel on its own. A woman named Sophia, a supposed family friend Meghan had recruited to corroborate her story, appeared on a daytime segment, claiming Helen had always been cold and controlling. But within days, reporters uncovered inconsistencies. Sophia hadn't seen Helen in over 15 years. Her accusations collapsed under scrutiny, forcing a sheepish retraction. Meanwhile, Meghan's brother Jake, who had eagerly attached himself to her narrative, found his own skeletons dragged into the light. Financial mismanagement, unpaid debts, failed ventures. Each headline shredded his credibility further. Meghan's crusade had pulled him into the spotlight, and the spotlight burned. Helen heard all of it secondhand. Caroline Myers, her oldest friend, called one evening, her voice buzzing with excitement. "They're eating themselves alive, Helen." Sophia's embarrassed, Jake's broke, and Meghan looks like a fool in every interview. "You're coming out of this shining." But Helen didn't gloat. She simply smiled into the quiet of her cabin, the warmth of the fire licking at the chill in her chest. "I told you," she murmured. "The truth doesn't need me to defend it." Yet beneath the serenity, she felt the storm shifting. Meghan wasn't finished. Women like her didn't crumble at the first sign of exposure. They clawed deeper, lashed harder, desperate not to lose control. Helen rose from her chair and moved to the window. Snow blanketed the pines in silence. The world outside her cabin calm and untouched. But she knew peace was only the surface. The courthouse in Aspen wasn't grand, but its stone facade and heavy oak doors carried a gravity that even the snow-dusted mountains couldn't soften. On the morning of the hearing, Helen arrived quietly, her coat buttoned high, David at her side. She didn't need to draw attention. The attention would find them. Inside, the air buzzed with reporters whispering, their pens ready, cameras hanging from their necks like vultures waiting for scraps. Meghan made her entrance minutes later, heels striking the marble floor like a war drum. She wore a fitted black suit, her hair sculpted into perfection, her lawyer trailing behind with an armful of files. The defiance in her step said everything. She wasn't here for reconciliation, she was here to win. The judge entered, and the room stilled. "This is a hearing to review the contested will of Helen Marshall," the bailiff announced. Meghan's lawyer rose first, a man with a polished smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He launched into his argument with theatrical flair. "Your Honor, we intend to show that Mrs. Marshall acted out of emotional distress, pressured by circumstances that clouded her judgment. My client, Meghan Marshall, has been a devoted member of this family for over 10 years. To erase her without cause is not only cruel, it reflects a decision made under duress." Helen sat in the second row, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch, didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on David, who rose calmly when it was his turn. His voice carried no theatrics, just precision. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Helen Marshall's actions were deliberate, thoughtful, and legally sound. The new will was executed with every safeguard in place. There is no evidence of coercion, no proof of incapacity. The only distress here, David said, glancing toward Megan, is that of someone disappointed by entitlement denied. Megan shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. The lawyer countered quickly. But isn't it true that this sudden change came immediately after a conflict between Helen and my client? Surely that timing suggests rashness, an emotional overreaction, not a measured decision. The judge leaned forward. Do you have proof of this so-called conflict, counselor? The lawyer hesitated, riffling through his notes. Testimony, Your Honor. From whom? Megan Marshall herself. The judge's brow arched. So, self-reported grievance, nothing independent, no corroborating witness, no documented evidence. The room rustled with quiet whispers. Helen's lips curved faintly, not a smile exactly, but the closest thing to one she'd allowed in weeks. David rose again, unhurried. Your Honor, the timing reflects nothing more than a woman reaching her final straw after years of disregard. Helen Marshall came to me of her own free will. We reviewed her estate over several meetings. Every step was explained, confirmed, and signed in her presence. I filed those documents myself. They are airtight. The judge looked down at the paperwork in front of her, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness. The silence stretched, every shuffle of paper sounding like a gavel strike. Finally, she lifted her gaze toward Megan's lawyer. Counselor, your arguments are thin. You're asking this court to disregard properly executed documents on the basis of feelings. Her tone hardened. That is not how inheritance law works. Megan's lawyer stammered, the Polish cracking. But surely, Your Honor, the court must take into account— Enough, the judge cut in. The word echoed off the paneled walls. Final. Megan's face flushed deep crimson. She turned toward Tom, who sat stiffly beside her, his hands twisting in his lap. He avoided her eyes, his guilt written plain across his posture. Helen, still in the second row, exhaled slowly, her gaze steady on her son. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the storm Megan had whipped around them both. She had braced for this battle, and now she could feel it, the tide turning. David leaned close, his voice low but certain. We've won this round, Helen. She has no ground left. But Helen didn't celebrate. She knew better. Megan wasn't the type to accept loss gracefully. The courtroom was hushed when the judge returned after recess, robe swishing as she ascended the bench. Papers shuffled, reporters leaned forward, and the weight of the moment pressed down like the mountain snow outside. All rise, the bailiff called, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. When the judge seated herself, the silence was absolute. I have reviewed the evidence and the arguments presented, she began, her tone crisp, carrying no warmth. Her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Megan, then on Helen, who sat calm and composed in the second row. It is the decision of this court that the most recent will and testament of Helen Marshall stands as filed. A sharp inhale cut the air. Megan's. The judge continued without pause. The claims made by Megan Marshall and her brother, Jake Myers, are dismissed with prejudice. There is no credible evidence of undue influence, emotional duress, or incompetence on the part of Mrs. Marshall. The documents are legally sound and enforceable. The words landed like stones, final and unmovable. Jake surged to his feet, his face blotchy with frustration. This is outrageous. She's cutting us out like garbage after everything. The gavel cracked once, loud as thunder. Sit down, Mr. Myers, the judge commanded. Another outburst, and you'll be held in contempt. Jake froze, the bravado draining from him as quickly as it had flared. He sank back into his seat, shoulders sagging. For all his bluster, there was nothing left to fight. Megan sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. The flush in her cheeks had risen to her temples, and her eyes burned holes into the floor. Tom shifted beside her, his body angled away, shame radiating in every line of him. Helen didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her hands remained folded neatly, her expression serene. She had nothing to prove. The victory wasn't in the court's ruling, it was in her refusal to be shaken. The judge signed the order, the gavel struck once more, and just like that, it was over. But outside those courtroom doors, it had only begun. By the time Helen and David stepped into the crisp winter air, the press had swarmed. Flashbulbs popped. Questions flew like hail. "Mrs. Marshall, do you feel vindicated? What's your response to Megan's accusations? Do you believe family ties should outweigh legal rights?" Helen said nothing. She kept her chin lifted, her steps even, David shielding her from the crush. Silence was her answer, and it was louder than any statement she could give. The next morning, the headlines blazed across Colorado papers and online feeds alike. Matriarch battles back, dismissing entitled heirs. Judge upholds will in Marshall family dispute. Daughter-in-law's case crumbles in Aspen court. If Megan had hoped to appear the victim, the court of public opinion had turned against her. Clips from the hearing replayed, showing her lawyer stammering, her brother silenced, her own expression twisted in anger. Commentators called her spoiled, opportunistic, reckless. Helen read none of it. Caroline phoned her with breathless updates, but Helen only smiled faintly and returned to her tea. "Let them write what they want," she told her friend. "My life isn't lived in their papers." Meanwhile, Jake slipped out of Aspen quietly. Debt collectors circled like wolves, his financial failures now public fodder. He had neither the fight nor the money to continue, and his retreat was quiet, almost pitiful. Megan, however, stayed. And though the ruling had cut her down, the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. At the lodge days later, she was seen with her lawyer again, her lips pressed thin, her posture stiff. She wasn't finished, not yet. Helen knew it too. Victories in court didn't always end wars. Sometimes they lit the fuse for battles still to come. The ink on the court's order was barely dry before the counterattack began. Within a week, Aspen's gossip columns and Denver's talk shows lit up with new accusations. Megan and Jake's last-ditch effort to claw back control of the narrative. "She's not the saint she pretends to be," Megan said in a shaky voice during a televised interview. "Helen has always been manipulative, cold, even cruel. You don't know what it's like to be on the inside of that family." Jake, standing beside her, nodded solemnly as if he carried the weight of truth. "She plays the victim now, but she's been controlling Tom's life since he was a kid. This is just another way she's trying to pull the strings." Their words dripped into the public bloodstream, but the effect was weaker than they hoped. By Tuesday morning, Helen sat at her cabin's window table, steam curling from her teacup, as the television replayed snippets of the interview. The snow outside fell steady, soft, as though it too was unmoved by the theatrics. The phone rang. Rachel, an old colleague from Helen's teaching days, sounded breathless. "Helen, I don't know if you've seen, but they're saying awful things. It's everywhere. The papers, the radio." "I've seen it," Helen interrupted gently, her tone calm. "They're calling you manipulative, saying you cut Megan out to punish Tom. Can you believe?" Helen raised her cup, sipping slowly, letting Rachel's words tumble over themselves. "Let them talk," she said finally, her voice steady. "It only makes them look worse." There was a pause on the line, then Rachel chuckled softly. "You always were the unshakable one." But Helen wasn't blind to the storm. She knew Megan was banking on public outrage, hoping that if the law couldn't be bent, then reputation could. Yet, cracks were already forming. Within days, investigative reporters dug into Sophia, the so-called friend who had resurfaced months earlier to parrot Megan's version of events. Records showed she hadn't spoken to Helen in over a decade. One journalist even unearthed emails proving Megan had coached her on what to say. When confronted, Sophia stammered through a retraction, her credibility shredded live on air. As for Jake, his unraveling was swifter. His financial house of cards, already teetering, collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. Local papers unearthed unpaid loans, failed business ventures, and lawsuits filed by former partners. Headlines shifted from Family Feud in Aspen to Jake Meyer's mountain of debt exposed. Helen read none of it firsthand. Carolyn clipped articles for her, leaving them on the cabin counter when she visited, but Helen left them unopened. Her victories weren't meant to be savored in ink. They lived in the quiet steadiness of her mornings, the peace that returned each time she refused to answer chaos with chaos. Still, when she looked into the flames at night, Helen knew silence wasn't an end. Megan wasn't the type to surrender because public opinion turned. No, this was a woman who would keep swinging until the last scrap of power slipped through her fingers. And Helen was ready for that too. The cracks in Megan and Jake's alliance didn't just show, they split wide open for the whole town to see. Aspen was small enough that whispers traveled faster than snowmelt, and before long, every cafe, lodge, and boutique on Main Street hummed with the same refrain. Megan and Jake can't even hold their own house together. At first, they tried to keep appearances. Megan swept into the lodge one evening, wearing a designer coat, Jake trailing behind her like a man already defeated. She laughed too loudly at the bar, ordered wine she couldn't afford, and spoke as though the verdict had never happened. But Jake's eyes gave them away, dark circles, a twitch in his jaw, the look of someone collapsing under debts and disgrace. By the following week, Megan's patience snapped. A neighbor spotted her loading boxes into the back of an SUV, her movements sharp, furious. She slammed the trunk shut, climbed behind the wheel, and drove off without so much as a backward glance. Jake stood in the driveway, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face pale against the winter dusk. He didn't chase her. He didn't even wave. He just watched as the car disappeared down the icy street, carrying with it the last illusion of stability. That night, Helen's phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "I'm sorry, Helen, for all of it. For not standing up when I should have. For letting her drag us all through this. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know." Helen stared at the message, the words glowing in the dim light of her cabin. For a moment, her thumb hovered, but she didn't open it further. With a single swipe, the screen went dark, the apology erased before it could root itself in her heart. Some wounds weren't hers to tend. Outside, the snow fell heavy, blanketing the world in silence. Helen drew the curtains, lit the fire, and poured herself another cup of tea. The flames flickered, the wood hissed, and the room filled with the steady warmth she had chosen for herself. No drama, no manipulation, just peace. In the days that followed, that peace grew. Strangers in town nodded kindly when she passed, their eyes full of quiet respect. At the community center, parents thanked her for the fundraising drive she had championed. Even Carolyn, ever the loyal friend, remarked over lunch, "Helen, I don't think I've ever seen you so light. It's like you finally set a burden down." Helen smiled, the truth of it radiating through her. She had made the right choice, not just with the will, but with every decision since. She had refused to bend, refused to let cruelty masquerade as family, and now, at last, she could breathe. But in the quiet of her cabin that evening, as the fire dwindled low and the snow pressed dark against the windows, Helen felt a faint unease stir beneath the peace. Not fear, never fear, but awareness. She knew Megan too well. A woman who thrived on control did not disappear quietly into the night. Helen lifted her gaze toward the window, her reflection layered against the black glass. Somewhere beyond the snow, Megan was still out there, stripped of wealth, stripped of standing, but not yet stripped of malice. Spring thaw came slowly to Aspen, the mountains shedding their heavy snow in rivulets that shimmered like glass in the morning sun. For Helen, it felt like a season of her own. Ice melting, light returning, and the weight of a long winter finally lifting. The community center's courtyard was alive with voices one Saturday morning, children racing between folding tables, parents chatting over coffee, and volunteers arranging banners that read, "Aspen Youth Fundraiser." Helen stood among them, clipboard in hand, her gray hair catching the sunlight, her presence steady as ever. "Mrs. Marshall," one mother said warmly, pressing her hands over Helen's, "this program wouldn't exist without you. My son, he's thriving here. Thank you." Helen's smile was quiet but genuine. It wasn't money alone that mattered. It was what it could build. Structure, safety, opportunity. That was the true inheritance she wanted to leave behind. Her reputation, once a whispered question in the lodge corridors, now gleamed in the open. Articles that had once painted her as vindictive now ran features calling her a pillar of resilience, and the matriarch who turned trials into triumph. Every event she attended drew gratitude, not suspicion. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the cabin, tucked into a plain envelope. Helen opened it carefully, unfolding neat handwriting that carried her back decades. Dear Helen, I don't know if you remember me, but I was a fellow teacher in Denver all those years ago. I heard about what you've been doing for the community in Aspen, and I had to reach out. Back then, I admired your patience with your students, your insistence on fairness. Seeing your name in the papers now, still standing tall, doesn't surprise me at all. The world needs more Helens, and I'm grateful you're still out there making a difference. The letter ended simply. With respect and gratitude, Eleanor Price. Helen sat by the fire that evening, the letter spread across her lap. She read it twice, then a third time, the words softening something deep in her chest. She had weathered accusations, betrayal, manipulation, but here was proof that her truest self had endured through all of it. Not the caricature Megan had tried to sell, but the woman her colleagues, her community, and her conscience knew her to be. She leaned back, allowing herself a rare, unguarded smile. Contentment, not triumph. The kind of quiet joy that came from knowing her life was not defined by who she excluded, but by who she lifted up. Meanwhile, the stories filtering back about Jake and Megan painted a different picture. Jake's house was rumored to be under foreclosure, creditors circling like hawks. Megan, once so quick to command attention at the lodge, had disappeared from Aspen society altogether. Even her allies avoided her calls now, her name too toxic to touch. Their wealth had withered, their reputations soured, their futures uncertain. And yet, Helen didn't dwell on their downfall. She didn't need to. Their lives were unraveling by their own hand. She had chosen a different path. That spring, Helen attended a charity gala downtown. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, tables draped in white linen, the hum of conversation blending with the strains of a live string quartet. As she walked in, heads turned, not out of scandal, but out of respect. Caroline squeezed her arm. "Look at you," she whispered with a grin, "finally being seen for who you've always been." Helen lifted a glass of champagne during the evening's toast, her eyes sweeping across the room filled with supporters, families, and friends. The applause that followed was not for wealth alone. It was for integrity, for endurance, for the strength of a woman who had refused to bend under cruelty. She felt it then. As surely as she felt the glass cool against her palm, she had created something lasting, something that would remain long after she was gone. Her legacy wasn't a cabin or an estate. It was dignity turned outward into generosity. But later that night, as the gala wound down and she stepped out into the cool mountain air, a ripple of unease touched her spine. Across the street, partly hidden in shadow, a figure lingered just a little too long before turning away into the dark. By summer, the mountains had traded their snowcaps for ribbons of green, wildflowers pushing through thawed earth, rivers rushing high with meltwater. Aspen bustled with tourists and locals alike, but for Helen, the season marked something else: renewal. The charity she had once nurtured like a fragile sapling had grown into something vibrant. The new wing of the community center was buzzing with energy, art classes filled with chatter, tutoring rooms alive with laughter, a play yard echoing with children's shouts of joy. Women from the shelter found steady work through the program, their faces brighter each time Helen visited. "You've changed this place," Lily Adams, the real estate agent turned ally, told her one afternoon as they walked the grounds. "It's more than a community center now. It's hope, with walls and windows." Helen's heart swelled, not with pride, but with something deeper: purpose. Meanwhile, Jake and Megan had all but vanished. Rumors floated like ash in the wind. Jake living out of a rented condo in Denver, Megan spotted in a cheaper neighborhood store, hair unkempt, eyes wary. The lodge no longer whispered their names. Invitations stopped coming. Their reputations, once polished to a shine, were permanently tarnished, their absence speaking louder than their presence ever had. Helen didn't revel in their fall. She didn't need to. Silence had delivered what no argument or courtroom ever could: erasure. They had undone themselves. Her days settled into a rhythm she hadn't thought possible months earlier. Mornings at the cabin with tea in her garden, afternoons at the center, evenings with Carolyn, sometimes with old records spinning, sometimes with nothing but conversation and the sound of fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time in years, her life belonged wholly to her. One evening, as twilight draped itself over the mountains, Caroline leaned back in her chair and studied Helen. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" she asked softly. From that night with the heater to now? Helen's gaze drifted to the window, where the last streaks of sunlight painted the sky in gold. "I think about it every day," she admitted. "Not because I want to relive it, but because it reminds me how strong I had to become, and how much stronger I am now." Caroline raised her glass. "To strength hard-earned." A few weeks later, Helen's friends surprised her with a small celebration at the lodge, an irony that wasn't lost on her. The same place Megan had once used as her stage now held a circle of people applauding Helen's resilience. The air was warm with music, the scent of roasted lamb and pine-scented candles filling the hall. She listened as people toasted her contributions, the programs she had funded, the lives she had touched, the dignity with which she had carried herself. Helen stood, cheeks faintly flushed, and accepted the applause with grace, not with grandeur, never with that, but with quiet acknowledgement. Yet even as the night waned, she knew her work wasn't finished. The gala had planted a seed in her mind, something larger, something lasting, a foundation, not just a fundraiser, not just a program, but a structure that would live on long after she was gone. It would bear her name, yes, but more importantly, it would bear her values: respect, resilience, dignity. Weeks later, the papers were signed. The Helen Marshall Foundation was born. Helen stood on her cabin porch the night it became official, the mountains bathed in moonlight, the pines whispering in the breeze. She thought of Tom, of Jake, of Megan, of all the noise, the venom, the attempts to bend her will. And then she thought of the children at the center, the letter from Eleanor, the applause at the lodge. Her legacy was not war. It was not spite. It was this, something Megan could never touch, never tarnish. She lifted her chin, her voice steady as she whispered into the cool night air. "I didn't need to teach her a lesson. Life did that for me.